And without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Prime Minister.
Sorry, don't smoke, kids. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. We're going to set up this debate by clarifying what the burden is on each side, characterizing where it is and isn't used, and providing a metric of what is legitimate in warfare. We'll be defending the combatant, non-combatant divide, and proving that the local religion, the one that has the local sites, is a combatant in the war and therefore is a legitimate target. Let's start with our burdens. Tactical warfare being legitimate doesn't mean it is always legitimate or legitimate in any war. The opposition need to defend blanket that in all cases it is illegitimate, that it is never a legitimate tactic of warfare to do this. As an example, bombing an energy plant is sometimes a legitimate tactic of war and sometimes not. I know you're making faces, but the chair seems to be okay with it. But secondly, it's not about killing civilians. It's just about desecrating the holy sites. So it doesn't then become okay to murder all of the civilians within that site. We still need to inform that we're about to bomb this place or bomb at night or something like that. Where do I think it will and won't be used? It won't be used in the Dome of the Rock, in the Hagia Sophia, or in the Vatican, both because of capacity. None of these countries are under attack. Because of backlash, the harm from doing this is way too big. Because of the universality of these places as being important to various religions. When do we think it will be used? We think that in modern times, it'll be used in local religious sites and institutions. It looks like fundamentalist regimes or organizations. It looks like terror groups that believe in their own sects, like ISIS or the Taliban, where the burial sites of their own important religious clerics become their own holy sites. Like it looks like the headquarters of the local religion wants to bomb the Russian Orthodox Church, then they'll destroy ancient cathedrals in Moscow, not in Constantinople. Honestly, most of the cases where this debate happens are historical, because today far less of the world does war and far less of the world is religious. We think that historically, when desecration was used, it was legitimate, as opposed to when villagers were massacred. So let's justify our metric of the combatant-non-combatant divide. We think first, why do we need to have this divide? Look, war is always brutal. When I kill a man with a gun, that's still a civilian who has kids and got enlisted. When I destroy a bridge that's transporting tanks, it's also a bridge that connects a village to their nearest town. So we want to have some limit of what is and isn't legitimate within this brutality. We want to prevent the most common norms of war in the past that were horrible, like pillage and plunder, rape and torture, murder of captives and civilians. The distinction devised by philosophers and chosen by states is the combatant-non-combatant divide. Why? Because our rules of war need to be enforceable. If we try to limit attacks on combatants, countries wouldn't abide by it. So we don't focus on limiting combatants, but non-combatants. We want an effective war that's focused on resolution, not on harm. Therefore, when people attack opponent combatants, they're advancing the war, as opposed to when they attack non-combatants and are simply harming the other side. When we do this, we limit the overall scale of the war while still allowing the war to be enacted. Where do we see this as being true? It looks like POW laws. As soon as a soldier is cornered and puts down their gun, they become a non-combatant and can't be attacked. It looks like any assault on civilians. Now, note, people arbitrarily enabling the war doesn't make them combatants. If I'm a taxpayer, that doesn't make me a combatant. It's not enough for us to show that the religion is a taxpayer. We have to show that the religion is a combatant. Let's take a POI from opening.
You realize, since you're Israeli yourself, that if you hide a bunch of bombs in a civilian infrastructure or you put terrorists in there, the army can roll in anyway because it's not desecrating their homes, it's attacking an enemy.
Yes, I don't mean that no, you know what's fair? I'm going to bite this bullet. I don't think that we're talking about the weapons being in those religious sites. We mean that the moralization, the fervor is done in those sermons before those soldiers then go out to fight. Let's prove fulfillment of the metric. Why is religion tied to war? First, on religious wars, a majority of wars in history were such. It's either wars between religions or wars over dominance of a religion. Second, we think, and most importantly, this is one of the strongest reasons for war, believing that God is on our side. So the biggest reason why people avoid war is that they're scared of death. but if they're scared of loss. But if God is on our side, that's unlikely. The second reason is people are unsure whether this is a just war. Is it just to kill in this war? It is if God is on our side. This means that nations specifically use God and religion to overcome reluctance to go to war and political opposition to go to war. Shaurya says on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict started not with the settlement of Jews here, but with the religious enfervoring of Palestinians going, these people are not just here for land, they're here to take away your religious rights. Let's talk about active support, because religion is usually directly tied to the state. Religions receive state supports. They are state sanctioned, as in they're given priority over all other religions, and they're actively kept in check. Because they are one of the biggest threats to the state power, then the states ensure that appointees are supportive of the state. Maybe not in Rome, which is a democracy, but certainly in Moscow or in Afghanistan. Why does this make religious sites legitimate? First, we have the logic of total war. We allow the destruction of war manufacturing facilities, of intelligence offices, of ports, of propaganda disseminating institutions. Anytime an institution directly contributes to the war effort and the war effort is dependent on it. Secondly, we still need to respect civilians. This means we don't bomb a factory without warning that you're going to bomb there, but we do bomb the factory itself. That means that the site, if the site is used for war, the site becomes a legitimate target, even if occasionally it is also used not for war. Even if this factory also manufactures other stuff, if this power plant also supports people, or if this holy site also provides people with religious services, it is still illegitimate. It is still legitimate to bomb them at the point where they're also a combatant. Why does losing your site make you actively demoralized? Emphasizing both the resolution of wars and why religions are a combatant. You feel that God isn't on your side. He let this happen. You also see that you're clearly losing. You're unable to defend what's most important and central to you. This can create a crisis of faith. Maybe the other side's religion is more correct than yours. What does this do? It increases desertion by soldiers, decreases their motivation to fight, loses civilian support for the war, and all of this is a feedback loop. Once you start getting demoralized, you become far more demoralized because of your effect on the rest of the ranks. For all of these reasons, opening government.
I would like to thank Speaker Mann for this speech, and I would like to invite the first speaker for the opposition.
Am I clearly audible?
Sorry, can you say it again?
Yeah, this is why I check. What about now? Am I clearly audible? Okay, thank you very much. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The basic humanity that people have for their enemy combatants is that we don't cross a few lines. We don't go into their homes, we don't go into their mosques, and we don't go into their children's nursery homes and murder people for no reason. I want to first point out that government's moral justification for this is incomprehensible. Because if it is the case that moralizing people to go out for war is something that is enough justification for violating the rules of law, then in that case, can I not cut into any media house pushing propaganda for the state? Can't I bomb any civilian whose child is a soldier who is encouraging that soldier to go out and fight the war? Can't I bomb community centers that award soldiers for their heroic bravery? The point is that societies do have opinions and thoughts that they express. Often they support their own civilians and soldiers. Even terrorists have their families and friends who support them. The difference is they didn't enter the fight. They didn't take the action. Thought crime is not the same as an actual crime. We don't punish people who simply support family members because they're going out to war because they believe it's justified. We focus on these soldiers. The logical implication of OG is that it is justified to target any civilian infrastructure. I don't think this principle can stand. But second of all, like I said, obviously you can still target terrorists who are inside mosques. You can target terrorists who are inside religious institutions. No law actually says you can't do this. Like I said, Israel already does this, and so do most countries. How is this likely to be used? 2 reasons. This exacerbates the intensity of war and makes it a long-term identity conflict, and then the principle. First, note that this is likely to become extremely more likely to be used in hateful wars that are focused on identity and hatred of the other side. Note that when India attacks Pakistan, there is a long history of conflict and tension about the people in Pakistan. And there's a lot of propaganda meant to dehumanize the enemy in the first place, because that's how you justify the war. But there are always restrictions. You don't see people bombing civilians in most wars, only in instances where it is so extreme and intense that people believe that it's justified, such as when Hamas bombs people in Israeli cities. Note that as a result of this, in hateful wars, this immensely increases the intensity of these wars. Because note that in war, personal anger makes a big difference in decisions, because they're made quite quickly in tense situations, which you can justify later, and often the chain of command has to be fast. If it is not, it is easy for enemies to exploit increasing checks and bureaucracy. If there is a blanket ban on attacking these religious sites, as well as other civilian infrastructure, it is unlikely you desecrate them for no reason. But second of all, in wars where justification is unlikely to happen, often countries want some kind of justification. So you can use the idea of this person's religious identity being bad. But more importantly, even if you don't, once you bomb the religious sites, the backlash will be intense. There will be narratives about people talking about how frustrating and just offensive it is that they bombed a mosque. It doesn't matter if the mosque or the church was supporting the army. It doesn't matter if they were actually people who cared about militants. The perception is that your whole religion has been attacked. This means internationally, people across the country often continue hatred. This justifies long, unjustified wars in the first place in a way that cannot be done otherwise. Until you get the civilians to start spouting extremely radical, hateful things, it is often difficult to continue these wars. But third of all, this is sometimes used to reduce morale against others and make them lose hope. But the thing is, you can do this in many other ways. You can do this through pamphlets that talk about how our army is losing. You can do this through actually creating moderate versions of these religious institutions that give them alternatives, jobs to the poor who are joining these armies, finding strategic ways to work with the civilian government in diplomacy and negotiation. We're fine with all of those. We don't think that reducing morale requires you to bomb someone's civilian infrastructure. Then, two impacts of this. First, why it's likely to increase frustration from the other side, and second, why it's likely to increase war crimes. First, for the other side, note that these are extremely helpful mediators in the future, the moderate versions of these churches and mosques, because they're extremely relevant to the community. Otherwise, there would be no morale impact, obviously. And they often protect the poor because they occupy state gaps of provision, because they give charity to people who don't have anyone else protecting them. They give solace, and frustration has been cleared for people who go to the pastor in these churches when they're really, really desperate. Thus, when you convince them that peace is the best option, and a lot of these people are open to this because of three structural reasons. First of all, a lot of these churches and mosques don't actually support the war because often they're mostly pushed on peaceful narratives that go across national boundaries. So patriotism doesn't work when a country is fighting another country with either a similar or different religion that has some relations to it. So not all Muslims think Christians are all evil and must be gunned down. Often there's a sense of brotherhood between them. But second of all, they often want stability because the average citizen often doesn't even support wars in many instances, especially when they're from a weaker country like Ukraine being invaded by Russia, or for example, in a war where one country is a belligerent actor. So they want to reduce the conflict and they want to protect people. So you lose this opportunity because often it seems like they're blasphemers because you have been characterized as the demon who is attacking their own religion, because that is obviously the easiest way for the state to respond. That is the way to raise bodies. And you lose that opportunity to rebuild in the future. What is the impact of this? The long-term harm of this is that state rebuilding becomes significantly more difficult when you don't have communitarian leaders on your side. But second of all, this means radicalism rises. Even if you stop the war, there's always going to be terrorists pushed by religious narratives because the loss of that irreversibly important monument, the Golden Temple in Amritsar, or for example, obviously you might not attack the Kaaba, but you might attack an important mosque to reduce morale. At that point, people feel like it is not justifiable if they're particularly religious and feel like their own holy duty to protect God and his houses has been taken out. They're more likely to continue believing in this. Why is this the case? Before that, CG quickly.
Why do we allow the bombing of government buildings, which will harm the sense of nationalism and the duty people have to their own country?
Well, I don't think you allow civilian government buildings to be bombed, but if you do, I'm fine to oppose that as well. I think the only real way to justify this is that the government literally orders these attacks, and so to some extent you can justify it. And people who are explicitly involved in taking actions against someone is very different to someone who's supporting the narrative that they often don't even control in terms of propaganda. Okay, there's a fine line there, but I think that line matters. Okay. Second of all, why this is likely to cause more war crimes and why the principle of this is important. First, note that you explicitly tell soldiers to dehumanize other people because their religion is no longer respected. You don't draw a line at attacking people who are in mosques, but you create the mindset that the empathy you either had in the past, which is that these people's religious monuments are off the mark, they're off the line, you cannot attack them, goes away at the point you can desecrate them. And note, desecrating is an important word. The maximum morale impact you can do is to piss in the fonts of these temples, to break them down and to make it a mockery so that people feel worse after it is done. So that means the hatred and anger that you make these soldiers take out on these monuments makes them feel like it's okay for them to reduce civilian morale. The same logic they use for these mosques often means that it's much more easy to commit things like war crimes. Note the mechanism for this. Soldiers often have their children, and sorry, not the children, like their allies killed in front of them. They see people shooting at them every day and they feel anger and vengeance and hatred. This means you have one more way to hurt these people when you can attack their civilian infrastructure. Note, this is obviously not perfectly accountable in the world, but when they do it, we still do not support it, we oppose it. On that, I didn't run the principle, but Jess will, so opening opposition.
I'd like to thank Speaker for a speech. Now I'd like to invite the second speaker for the government.
UNWE We. So the first thing I want to point out is that the opening opposition seems to agree with our metric, which is to say, what is the criteria for war crime, and why in this case this is the, maybe they disagree on why this in this case this is the criteria for war crimes, on which I will answer later, but it seems to agree with that. Why it is important? Because their only case is about utilitarianism. They talked about why many times this, when you actually harms religious sites, this is actually can create harms and that kind of things. The importance of this is that they didn't analyze, this doesn't prove why it is an illegitimate tool. It proves why in many instances it is cause harms, but not why by its essence it is illegitimate tool. As an intuition pump, if I now bomb a military site, which is a legitimate tactic, we all agree on that, this can still create the same kind of backlash that they talk about. It can still create the same kind of harm, the same kind of war crimes, the same kind of escalation. This does not mean that in all instances, which is their burden, to say that this is not legitimate. It is to say that many times this will not be useful. This is a debate about the legitimacy of the act. This is not the utilitarian debate that OO thinks it is. Now, let's respond about what they're responding to our case. So they says that not in all instances you actually it doesn't make sense that when you actually harm people who support the war and that kind of thing, it will be considered a war crime. Two responses to this. Number one, it's not about solely the motivation for war. It's unique justification to go to war. It's the strongest way to overcome opposition to go to war. It's a state-funded and supported institutions that claims God supports this holy war of retribution. This is not only about people on the ground actually says the war is okay. It's about people participate. This is about one moment before the people actively participate in the war. Second of all, state media offices that serve pure war propaganda are absolutely legitimate targets on either side of the house. They need to engage with that. They are competence on either side of the house. Now, about the backlash and harm to the war effort and international hatred and that kind of things. Number one, it's unlikely to be international. What religious site would be destroyed that are important to broad groups? Specifically because of global backlash, Sunni holy sites are protected. We are talking about sites that are holy to the Pashtun Muslims, right? But secondly, if you claim it's ineffective war action, that may be sometimes true, but sometimes Ayal's analysis is true and it is effective and worse. This already makes it a legitimate action, at least in the cases where it is effective, and it probably will only be used when it's effective, as no army wants to invigorate their opponents. Now, OO seems to agree with our criteria of what constitutes a war crime crime, they seems to disagree with the why this in this specific case this meets the criteria. So let me give you five or six more reasons as to why these religious sites are actually being used to mobilization to the war and that kind of things. Number one, they have a lot of influence and authority. Religious leaders all the significant influence and authority within their communities. They utilize religious places such as mosques, such as temples or churches for recruitment purposes, by which they can leverage their position to rally individuals to join the cause, right? We think that the religious setting provides a sense of legitimacy and moral justification, making it which is easier to them to convince people to participate in armed activities in the first place. Second of all, we think that religious places offer an environment which is conducive to ideological indoctrination. We think that sermons, we think that teachings and religious gatherings can be used to propagate the ideologies and narratives that follow the conflict. The emotionally charged atmosphere combined with persuasive rhetoric can sway individuals towards extremist beliefs and convince them to take up arms. Thirdly, we think that religious places serve as a central hubs for community engagement. They provide opportunities for socialization, for networking, and mutual support. These interactions create a conducive environment for recruiters to identify potential fighters, especially among marginalized or like vulnerable individuals who make sense as who make like seek their sense of purpose and that kind of things. Number four, we think that religious places hold deep symbolic value and emotional attachment for believers, as they already said, right? We think that by exploiting this symbolism, recruiters can manipulate like religious narratives to frame the conflict as a holy or like a righteous cause by presenting participation in conflict as a religious duty or a way to defend the faith. They appeal to individual religious identity and sense of duty, which make like recruitment a lot more likely. Number three, but finally, we think that religious places, particularly those considered sacred or highly revered, we think that enjoy special protection or like reverence within society, which provide them a lot more cover or a sense of safety for recruiters and their activities. All of this means that these places are much more likely to use competent, and therefore therefore we should be consider them competent in the same way that we consider places that do a lot of propaganda, do a lot of incitement, and these kind of things. Before I move on, I'll be closing.
Right. If a civilian mother encourages her son to go to war, is it okay for you to bomb her home per your principle then?
If it encourages, depends on the situation. If it is very, very likely that you will go to the war, so yes. If it is not very, very likely, so no. We claim that in this case, this is very, very likely. Now, they can claim that these things are very, very important to people. It's like water, it's like food. Notice that the reason why water or food of people, of civilians, this is being considered as a war crime is not because of their importance to people. It is because their probability, their likelihood in actually getting people killed, in getting people died. How do we know that? Because if the criteria was the importance of what is to people, then we couldn't have done anything. We couldn't have palmed targets because anything can be important to people. This is a subjective criteria. Therefore, you have the most objective criteria and the most reasonable criteria you have to set. It's about how it harms like it is close to the to killing people. Therefore, this is not war crimes on our side of the house, but it is a legitimate target that we can do, since it is being used to gather people, to rally people, and that kind of thing. Because we set up criteria and we prove to you why we are meeting this criteria. Please support the motion. Thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker very much for a speech, and I would like to invite the second speaker for the opposition.
Okay, just 1 second. There's one thing I want to clarify at the top of this speech, which is OG's push that utilitarian metrics are irrelevant in this debate. I do not think this is the case at all, because if we can prove that the outcome of this would lead to irreparable and devastating consequences, obviously then it's just not legitimate. Like legitimate, a very common English interpretation of that would seem to suggest something that would lead to good outcomes. Then let's clarify when this is likely to be used and what is the context for this debate. Because opening government have an awfully narrow conception of this debate. Apparently it's only used in the most unique of circumstances where churches are hiding terrorists and are collaborating and are instrumental to the war. I think this motion infers an obligation on them to destroy religious sites in a far broader range of circumstances, e.g. for the demoralization arguments that they themselves raise, but let's accept their very narrow interpretation. Why this is likely to be used in a far wider remit than the situations they contend. Number one, people just make mistakes in war. You're operating under a lot of pressure with limited intelligence, heat of the moment. You might think something is true when it's not. But secondly, if you are hell-bent on your cause, you can justify any number of things. You can say you thought terrorists were there. You can say you thought that they were cooperating with the state, which suggests that this will actually be used in a far more widespread way, which I think further solidifies both our principled and practical claims in this debate. So let's talk about the principle now. And I want to give you some additional context because after the advent of wars in the last century, the international community came together and asked themselves, what is it that we think is legitimate in war? And set up a series of conventions to describe what is and isn't legitimate. The types of things that were considered not legitimate were things that go beyond what we think is inherent to our humanity, not using chemical weapons because they leave irreparable and lasting consequences on society. The same thing as landmines, the same thing as the use of sexual assault, for example, in war. Sorry, I had to use that example, but I think it's important to illustrate here. And the reason why we did that is because we acknowledge that there is an inherent humanity that we still want to keep, because after the war is over, we have to live with ourselves. We have to live with what we have done, and we have to cooperate and try to make amends with our neighbor. So that is important and why we have to retain some element of humanity in war. Why is it then that religious sites are so important? Number one, they are often the most instrumental thing in a person's life, the thing that connects them to identity, feeling and purpose, sense of what they are going to do in the afterlife. And the site is the point at which they actualize that identity. Those sites are often also historical. They often date back thousands of years and are an important part of history. Those sites are often a safe haven for some of the most vulnerable members of society, and are often accessed internationally. To which opening government says, well, these are going to be tiny, tiny sites. They're not going to be international. Number one, I just don't think this is always going to be the case, especially when you open up this as an avenue of war. But even if their contention is true, I don't know why that's any better. Small sites by minority religions are no less deserving of protection simply because they are not part of religions that the majority of the world seeks to follow. Opening government counteracts our principle with the following claim. They say, you are a legitimate combatant because you've encouraged the war, you have links to the state, you might encourage socialization and those sorts of things. They give a long list, but my rebuttal here will kind of broadly interact with all of their reasons, right? The first thing I want to observe in response is that they give very selective examples, right? Like, I just do not think it is going to be the case in a lot of wars that religions are doing the thing that they say. Often religions by their very identity are anti-conflict and often oppose wars, right? But secondly, even if religions are encouraging this to a small degree, I would posit that this has very little delta in the war. Often that war is inevitable and going to happen regardless because of the state's incentives. Note as well, religion is not democratic. So even if leaders are deciding this and deciding to support war, their followers certainly haven't, and it is unfair to desecrate their religious sites for any decisions that their leaders have made. And fourthly, as we know, the logical extension of this would just be to say that anyone encouraging a war, supporting a soldier, being social surrounding war would also be victims under opening government's conception of this debate. But finally, we know, as I already mentioned, that intelligence is often very bad. So therefore, we cannot always be sure that these people are legitimate combatants in war. All of this is just to say that we ought to preserve some of the humanity that we have. and opening government's justifications do not quite cut it. Before I continue, CG.
Most international laws aim to protect direct harm to citizens, such as not blinding them, directly torturing them. This is a secondary harm that you do not prove is a principle that should be protected, completely asserted.
I'm sorry, but if you think that the purpose of your life is to serve your God, losing that sight is for many people a far bigger harm than a physical consequence. You need to prove that physical harms are always worse than these harms. I just do not think you're going to be able to do that. Okay, opening government says you will end war sooner because you feel that God is not on your side, you're more likely to give up, right? But no, you're not going to be like, oh, this site was targeted, I must be wrong in my religion. You're not going to undo decades, years of that like indoctrination and feeling just because one site has been destroyed. In fact, you're more likely to be more fervent in your belief and believe that that other side are the devil, that they are wrong, and that you need to show strength and support your religion, right? And if it is true that we want to decrease morale, as Shaurya explained, there are other ways to do it that don't involve this heinous obstruction of humanity. But notably, Shaurya gave you a lot of mechanisms about why this escalates war. The fact that you're more likely to bring in more parties to that war at the point where it's no longer a conflict between just two countries, for example, or two communities, but everyone else that ascribes to that belief. And those ideological things are long lasting. It also means you're more likely to see the other party as someone whose humanity you also decry, which means you're more likely to escalate things like war crimes. And if you care at all about the post-conflict reconciliation of a state, you would want religions to not be desecrated because they often play an instrumental role in practical post-nation building, but also ensuring that people have a soul and are able to believe and, you know, have a sense of belonging again post a war. These are just very, very like horrible things, and again, make war totally illegitimate in this context. Proud to oppose.
I would like to thank Speaker very much for this speech, and I'd like to welcome the third speaker for the opposition.
Can you guys hear and see me? Okay, POIs in the chat. I'll take opening, or I'll take, well, probably opening. If closing want to offer stuff, that's also good. I might take two. Please only use POIs for offering. Only use the chat for offering POIs. Please don't put other things in there. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Before I give you two claims, one on a principle of proportionality and why doing so is disproportionate, and second, why this degrades significantly greater degrees of harm than what opening opposition talks about, I want to do one line of response to closing government, which is the metrics they set out, which is doing an action that creates pressure to end the war sooner, one that does massive harm at the chance of fixing things, and one that might signal de-escalation. All are things that apply to literally nuclear warfare, because it does indeed create pressure to end the war sooner. It is, as in the US and Japan, signaling de-escalation, and it does massive irreparable harms by not only killing millions of people, by leaving them with scars and cancers that will make their lives irreparable. So closing government give you a beautiful justification for why it is okay for us to use nuclear warfare. So I'm really not sure where the moral line is on their side. I do think the O over POI is pretty fair here. So I'm not sure how that works. The proportionality of that is pretty messed. Let's talk then about proportionality, because that's a nice segue. So I want to be very clear here. On LO, all we get is the idea that we should not bomb civilians. Do they answer the question of why? No, they do not. This is important because opening opposition never give you a principal justification for this motion. And that means that sure, maybe sometimes this leads to an accelerated extent of harms, but maybe Gov Bench is right that you do it strategically and that you do it in effective ways. We're going to do this in a far more speculative way and give you the actual like non-consequentialist justification for why this is a fucked up thing to do. We think that it is illegitimate to do a disproportionate harm during war, because harm is obviously a bad thing, and although war is a necessary evil, we avoid harm where we can. At war, it is necessary to commit some harm, but it'll be minimized for two reasons. One, you have had a wrong done to you. We want to right that using conflict, but it's disproportionate to do a harm beyond righting that wrong. For example, Russia invades Ukraine. It's legitimate for Ukraine to take Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea back, but it is not legitimate for Ukraine to then go and conquer Russia, because that is a disproportionate response. But But second, this is why we think that if somebody showed up and tried to rob me, it's not okay for me to shoot them in the head in response. Or if someone shows up and attacks me with a knife, I shouldn't be able to attack them with like a fucking nuclear rocket, right? It's illegitimate for you to go beyond the extent of harm that is being done to you. It is only okay for you to respond with a proportional degree of that harm, because that is only the things that somebody is entering into. That is why I know it sounds stupid that opening opposition never says this, but this is the justification for why it's not okay for you to bomb hospitals and bomb civilians, is because it is beyond the veil of what is proportional based on the attack that has already happened to you. Why is desecrating religious sites disproportional by its nature? 3 reasons. 1, these are deeply important to you. You care about religion more than life itself. Now, I'll note, Diallo says that you have a connection to identity. I don't know what that means. What this means actually is that your God created you and gave you life. You will die for your God. Your mosque is Beit Allah. It is the house of God. You are not willing to have these harms happen to you. You love them. You learned in your mosque. These are things that you are not willing to have ripped away from you, and you will defend at any cost. Second, this is torturous. You are expected as an obligation by God, written in pretty much every single religious text, to defend the mosque and the temple. You feel as if you have failed this obligation if this happens, and it will go to hell. The issue here is simple. 1, in religion, the burden of causality is always on the believer of the people who had the attack happen to them. It is that you could have done something. You should have spent more money on guns and intel instead of doing it on shoring up civilians. You should have been preemptive and striking so that they wouldn't be willing to do this. You should have put your body on the line. You are racked with an irreparable guilt when this happens, and that is something that you can never get over. It is literally mental torture to you at the point at which you know that you're going to go to hell because you always could have done more than you already did. But second, you think this, even if this isn't the text of religion, you are scared of hell more than anything else. It is infinite torture. So you always fear that you could have done more. And so therefore you are responsible. So that is a torture that is created, which is disproportional. But third, trivially, I think that incentivizes doing it more, right? Because even if that's not the case, then what it means is that, like, you would do this more because it creates that degree of torture in a greater extent of degrees. And so therefore you're more preemptive because you don't want that to happen. But the fourth reason is that it affects third parties, because the harm of destroying an important site like Zoroastrian sites in Iran or Babylon in Iraq stretches beyond the people who are combatants. It hurts a variety of non-combatants who are entirely detached. Now, not even opening government can claim that, like, oh, some people are sometimes involved or not. Ultimately, these religious sites are important to people who are not just on the ground, who are not dependent on the conflict, who have done nothing wrong, and you are still willing to harm them, so therefore it's disproportional. What this means is that even if this slows down the war, the method of doing so is not a legitimate one. We think that nuclear weapons are never legitimate, even though they'd almost definitely slow down a war. So slowing down the war is insufficient to show that you should commit a legitimate action. Why can this never be proportional, even in the perfect situation? 1, the degree of some of the harm that you do. It's like killing somebody's whole family in front of their eyes. There's no situation in which the degree of harm on one side can justify the extent of harm that I've proven to you that occurs. It is always disproportional. But second, it's irreparable. These places are massively old in terms of the fact that they're religious sites that have been established over centuries, so that it can't be fixed. Oftentimes you have books and texts like old manuscripts of the Quran inside of them. They're known as being the sites of God. The Kaaba, for example, is known as the home of God. Like, sure, you don't bomb the Kaaba, but similar places. And I note, if it's a small religion, it means the impact is larger because more of their manuscripts are preserved there. More of their history is tied to that site. So it is more disproportional. And so therefore, even if you do this in the perfect way, it can never be principally justified. Before I go on to the practical elements of this debate, I'd like to take opening.
This debate isn't this House supports the use of desecration. It's a criteria debate about what makes a tactic a legitimate tactic in war. Therefore, it's a clear long diagon, good for that. But now engage with our blanket policy analysis. We don't have to support all attacks.
Yeah, that's fine. You don't have to support all of it. The last part of the analysis was it is disproportionate in all cases. So even if you don't have to justify always doing it, even doing it once is bad. So now let's talk about the illegitimacy of it. First, backlash. Note that opening opposition never weighs for you. Why does it cause backlash and aggression as opposed to what OG says of giving it up? Here's the reasons. 1, you see this as a test of God. You know that God is omnipotent and on your side. And even if they don't believe this independently, religious leaders tell you this because they want you to keep going and they don't want you to feel sad and lose morale. So you see the destruction of the site as a temple of God, so you continue. But second, you feel wrong. You want to get vengeance because when someone has taken everything from you, your God and your idols, you have nothing left to lose. The degree of the harms is awful. It means things things like acts of terror because people don't have things left to lose. It means that they're much more willing to use disproportionate conflict. It means that they up the ante in terms of developing and using dangerous weapons like chemical weapons. It's not just what OO says that the war drags on. It's that the war escalates. More civilians lose their lives. More danger happens, and it happens far more frequently. But second, asymmetric conflict. This allows for the bigger side to be shittier for 3 reasons. One, doing this makes it be used more because you can see the terror and effectiveness that it creates. Even if you do this and not in a blanket case, doing it once, it creates a permissibility for it to happen in the future. Second, crimes are least punished in an asymmetric conflict, right? Because you can get away with shit because you know that they can't fight back. But finally, the margin is valuable because in the Yazidis in Yemen, they have nothing left but their God. They are starving on the ground and they have nothing left. And now you're willing to even take their God away from them. And that is the greatest harm that you can do to them. Vote closing opposition.
I would like to thank Speaker Omar for a speech, and I would like to invite the last speaker for the opposition.
I will take a bathroom break, and I also need to get a new phone. This is on 2%. Sorry.
Okay.
Buy a new phone between speeches as you do.
And I'll also do the break.
Can I borrow your phone? Can I borrow your phone? Yes, I'm I am back with timer. I'll take a POI from closing. Just type in the chat. All right, great. Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Maria is correct. Wajeeh was quite flippant when they said that the logical extent of their case is they will cause nuclear war. I'm going to be significantly more charitable and engage more on the practical clash because that is what CG hinges their case on. The first thing I'm going to do is take out every single one of their mechanism as to why this probably means that they won't escalate the tension. The first one they said is that the average person is risk averse and so therefore they won't escalate. I have 2 responses to this. The first one is that the risk calculus is often very different for religious people, i.e. they believe that if they are okay with the desecration of war, if they're okay with just letting the war, the holy site go without any retribution, they're probably slighting God. And so therefore, insofar as they're risk averse, they don't want to face the slight chance that they might be displeasing God, insofar as this is something that's so monumental to them. And so therefore, insofar as they don't want to go to hell and face eternal suffering, they're probably going to react to this. But secondarily, you're just socialized to believe that every time you hurt God, you're just socialized to believe that every time you disable God, that's something that's inherently incorrect. And so therefore, you feel significant amount of anguish, you feel significant amount of pain. And insofar as you probably face pain in the short term as well, you probably also want to avoid this. And so therefore, insofar as this is probably the most important relationship that you've had in your life, you don't want to dishonor it. And so therefore, you probably want to, if it's correct that you're risk averse, you also want to avoid this pain. The second thing they said is people will be rational over the long term, and so therefore they'll cool off. I have 2 responses as to why this is probably untrue. The first one is that it's often the case that the biggest voices dominate discourse, i.e. the ones who are able to speak the loudest and the ones who are in most anguish often are able to crowd out other voices because they're the ones who are the most passionate. They're the ones who go out and tell people about their suffering because they are the ones who have the incentives to do so. But they're the ones who actually speak up and have the most inspirational or demoralizing story. And so therefore, they're probably more likely to actually get outreach. This means that this probably is significantly the case they're going to be vitriolic. The second thing they said, the second response I have is often it is just cyclical insofar as it sets the tone for what's to come, i.e. at the point at which the initial reaction is very angry filled and very vitriolic per the characterization of CG. This shifts the Overton window at the beginning. So if you were okay with calling the other side demons, or if you're okay with dehumanizing the other side, you're probably okay with it in the long term as well, insofar as you've probably already shifted the discourse towards the direction. The third thing they said is this is very costly, so you probably aren't going to continue the war. Just gut check this, right? Most people enter into war not because of economic reasons, for the simple reason that war is often just mutually economically damaging, i.e. if you go to war with the other country, this is money that you don't spend on like investment, this is money you don't spend on welfare, and so therefore, insofar as this is the case, the reason you go to war often is not economics, you're not going to make decisions based on that. The last thing they said is you will use sites to hide soldiers, so therefore you can, I don't know, kill like 3 or 4 less soldiers, and that's somehow the tipping point to ending the war faster. Firstly, this is just very marginal, but if you're correct to believe, if you want to believe their demoralization case, i.e. if you want to believe that this will cause so much demoralization that they're going to like lose the war and give up, then you probably are going to believe that this is something that's very important to them. So if this is something that's very important to them, they probably aren't going to face the risk of of it getting bombed, so they're not going to hide inside of it anyways, right? So if CG wants to tackle the impact, this mech falls. So then the question at the end of the debate then is, why is it likely that you are going to become more, you're going to not become demoralized, but you're likely to become more backlash and very angry? Because this is the other clash in this practical clash. Because the characterization coming from Gov is you're going to feel like God is not on your side. Note that Wajeeh already dealt with this in their extension, because there are no 2 ways in which you can probably rationalize it. The first way you can rationalize it is you can say this is a test by God, i.e. this is God testing our strength, and so therefore we must unite against our common enemy. The second way when you can just frame it is that you can frame yourself as being sinful. You're being punished for for not fighting hard enough, for losing the war, for losing grounds to the enemy. So therefore you need to react faster. Why is this a likely manifestation that's going to be believed rather than giving up? The first reason is that often religious people can just live with cognitive dissonance, i.e. for the simple reason that they can believe that karma exists, for the simple reason they believe that bad people can be punished, even when empirically it's untrue around them, they can still believe that God is on their side when they're losing. And so therefore, they probably are still going to believe that they have the strength and might of God to continue carrying on and continue fighting. And so therefore, they're going to fight with every single ounce they have and therefore continue the war. Secondarily, I just also want to note that religion is often your sole place of solace, i.e. you don't want to believe that God gave up on you, because this is often the relationship that you have formed throughout history, throughout your life, as a single coping mechanism. This has been the very thing that you have been this is the very person that you have confided all of your secrets to. Look for support in every single momentous part of your life. And so therefore, insofar as people as a form of defense mechanism, they're going to believe that God is not giving up on them, but rather I need to face his test and go harder. The simple intuition confidence is often when a partner leaves you, you probably don't want to believe that they fall out of love with you, but rather they're still in love with you. You probably are going to face significant denial, and so therefore you're going to continue believing God. The third reason, and this is very important, religious leaders are going to capitalize on this. Note that this dealing CG's case on religious leaders will use this in a good way and broker peace. Because if you don't blame, you're not going to blame God because he's your sole source of in meaning, but then you probably don't want to blame yourself either. You want to externalize blame in some way, and the easiest person to blame is often the leaders. The leaders have set us astray. The leaders have caused something sinful, and so therefore, insofar as the leaders know this, they preemptively rein in the narrative. They preemptively say that it was the enemies who caused it, the enemies that are Satan's, and so therefore, the types of narratives that are going to be spread are super fucking vitriolic. It's going to be things that tell you to go out and kill them, go out and do every single assault possible, which escalates the tension even further. Before I move on, you can deal with this.
Losing your church is a tangible, certain, and long-term harm. Getting revenge, in your best case, makes you feel good for a few minutes, and then you feel empty.
Right. It makes you feel good it doesn't make you feel good for a few minutes for all of the reasons I said before. For instance, you're going to feel good because you follow the very things that religious leaders tell you. You're going to feel good because you feel like you've passed the test by God. You're going to feel good because you feel like you have proven that you're not a sinful individual and you're not going to go to hell. You're going to feel good in the short term. And so therefore, for all of the reasons I said on your side, you're probably going to embark in some crusade or jihad and cause even more war on the other side, which escalates tension. Secondarily, on the principle clash, why the principle just takes it out irregardless? Because the response to our principle is quite flippant. The first thing they said is both sides can do this. This is not a justification. Both sides can kill. I can go and kill Ilya right now in the same room, but that doesn't mean that that's a justified action. Insofar as if both people can do it, the first mover who does this often has less justification to do so because he's not doing it in self-defense, but also there's less normative justification because you're causing harm like without any explanation, and that's just bad. But secondarily, I also want to know, they said, this is not dehumanizing because this is not like something that's a core part of the identity. The first thing, for all of my framing before, you're going to believe that this is a test from God. You're going to believe if you fail this, you're going to go to hell. So therefore, if you fail this test, if you let the site go to waste, you're going to face the significant torture of believing you're going to go to hell. The significant mental torture. CG can sit there, they're not okay with torture, so our side proves torture. So therefore, this is the line where they're able to draw. For all of these reasons, very proud to oppose.